I hear that introduction and I'm reminded of what Yuri Brofenbrenner said to me about my career. He said, your career is a study of the road to hell. So I hope we're not going down that road today. I have 2 programs I'm doing today. I'm going to try to do this one as a part 1. I hope it's engaging for the audience, but I'm not going to break it up so that I'm talking for 20 minutes and taking 10 minutes for questions and so on. But I think we'll still be in the audience, you'll still be engaged. Part 2 is the workshop. If you want to go into the workshop and really address some of these issues and questions, then we can do that. I'll also be around for the entire day here, so you can talk to me about different things. One of the things I like to start out with in this is exactly where my learning is. Because one of the things about my life and career at Cornell and through the whole child welfare system in the States has been taking a look at both positive deviants and negative deviants. And we're really talking right now about negative deviants. We're talking about those extremes at the ends of the spectrum. This afternoon, I'll balance it off, or with the workshop later this morning, I'll balance it off with some positive deviants. And we'll talk about healthy agencies and healthy organizations as well as toxic organizations. But you can see clearly the kinds of things that I've been involved with through the years. I have, truth be told, I retired from the university in 2008. I only work for them half-time. I spend the rest of my time as an expert witness for a number of cases around the U.S. So, I never or rarely am I an expert witness for the defendants. I'm usually an expert witness for the plaintiffs. So we're going to be talking about these kinds of organizations. These are a little different, and they might need a little bit of explanation. These are child welfare agencies, mental health agencies, and some juvenile justice agencies that I've been involved with, either in my work at Cornell or as an expert witness. PINS facilities, these are all residential care, congregate care facilities. PINS facilities are kids who have been placed in the States because of abuse or neglect, persons in need of supervision, mental health, psychiatric facilities, juvenile justice facilities. So I've been in the whole spectrum of child welfare facilities. Rarely do I get involved, though, in OMR, DD kinds of facilities. So we're really talking primarily about kids between the ages of 8 and 18 and the facilities that serve them. These kids, and I don't have to tell you that, you know them. They're vulnerable kids. They've had a lot of trauma history. They have developmental and relationship needs. They get placed in facilities, so they have additional trauma with separation from their families and their communities. And often within those facilities, you have this contagious effect of aggression, fear, and violence. The bottom line here that I think we have to understand is that you can make these kids worse. That placement for many of these children is the last best time to provide support and development and meet some of their developmental needs. It's the last best time. You may be able to do it later on. Much more difficult, though. The brain research right now really points to the fact that kids, as adolescents, we have one good chance to kind of rewire them. After that, much more difficult. I'm surprised at the number of people that I hear in child welfare who talk about these kids, and they talk about the kinds of events that occur to them in facilities and in treatment as they just brush that off. That's not something that really bothers them. They've seen much worse in their communities and in their families. Because it happens here, they'll get over it. It's one of those comments that just kind of perks up my ears, and I think, oh, okay, that's why I'm here in this particular facility. I would walk into facilities sometimes with a reputation of, here's a guy that's going to close us down. Now, I'd never had that kind of responsibility when I was working with technical assistants and agencies, and especially in New York State. On the other hand, you do get that kind of reputation. So, and a number of facilities that I worked with, in fact, were closed. I had nothing to do with it. Here's our definition of toxic organizations. Let me get specific. Police calls, 80 per month. A facility of 80 to 120 kids. 80 police calls a month. Runaways, 20 a month. These are not locked facilities except for juvenile justice. Restraints, over 100 a month. 1,200 a year for a 80 to 100 bed facility. Staff injuries, 5 to 8 a month. I always thought that was a little bit low, but I couldn't find much more than that. And in some facilities, one particular facility had 3 fatalities within an 8-year period. 3 fatalities in an 8-year period. So we're talking again about facilities that I would consider on the negative end of the spectrum. I might get an argument about that, but we can talk about that later on, maybe. Here are the elements we're going to talk about. Leadership, fear and aggression, clinical incident review, clinical participation, supervision, and training. I think what's important here to recognize is if some people may have heard me talk about this. I've actually condensed some of this for this particular presentation. I wanted to make sure I stayed within my 30 minutes. But, and we look at these particular themes, but I look at them within these contexts. Child's best interest, the impact of the events on kids or the placement, out-of-home care standards. And one of the things about out-of-home care standards, I think this is important, is that certain things start to come into consideration when you're dealing with out-of-home care standards. One is the issue of foreseeability. Parents don't have that standard as much as people who get paid to care for kids. You get paid because you're able to be an expert in this. You're a professional in this. So in fact, what you do is you give care. And you ought to be able to foresee risk. The other thing in facilities is that there's a much wider scope of culpability here. It's not just George abusing Jimmy, but also there's a wider scope here. Co-workers, supervisors, and so on. Let's focus. Okay. What I want you to do is just read this. Don't talk about it. Just read it. What's going on here? Somebody, what's going on here? Come on, quick. Pardon? They're having a great time.
Mistakes were made.
Mistakes were made. What else?
Deliberately taunting people.
Deliberately taunting people. All right.
Seems very mixed up.
It seems very mixed up. Right, right. Well, this is one of the examples of when we're talking about leadership. One of the things that we see in toxic, or I see in toxic organizations, is that the leadership of the organization is actually divorced from what the needs of the kids are. And this is a perfect example of a staff who's treating a sexually reactive unit, providing a birthday party for the executive, CEO, and dressing up in drag and performing skits. Perfect example of divorce here. Now, there are other things that we kind of see too. In toxic organizations, I see cultures that are rigid, or they're authoritarian, they're formal, they're very centralized. They communicate solutions to adverse effects or adverse events in the light of compliance and control. They don't take a look at adverse events in the light of learning. They want to be able to provide control and compliance. They're defensive about risk management, and actually risk management is generally seen as a negative experience. They give little support, and they're inconsistent with their accountability, which I think is an important factor. One of the things, we talk about supporting staff. We forget that there's a yang to that yin. Am I getting that right? And that's accountability. That you can, if you only support staff, you're doing half your job. You also have to provide accountability for staff. People are nodding. Good. Okay, so there's a good example right here of leadership that's divorced from the needs of the kids. You get these kinds of examples. I've got a ton of these things. I use this one because it grabs people's attention. Let's talk about program and mission. What's going on here? This is their program. This is their mission. This is what you have people telling you. I'm going to drive the devil out of these children. Now, I may get in trouble here. I usually get much more trouble back in the States, especially in the southern part of the country. There are, in the States, a good deal of child care and child welfare is provided by religious organizations. New York State, that's generally the Catholics, Protestants, and Jewish philanthropies. In other parts of the country, in some of the southern states, you can actually have a couple that has a religious calling, and they start a group home. And the state, if they go through a certain kind of process, will actually be able to they'll be able to certify them. And in some of these facilities, they're very religiously oriented. And you get this kind of response when you ask them what their program is or what their leadership is. And I'm also working with the TCI program at Cornell. Some of you may have heard that. It's one of the, can we call us competitors? But we often go into agencies and ask them what their program model is, and they say, well, TCI is. And then we realize they don't have a program model. Do you ever have that?
Well, we often find the term mapper is generically used. We mapper people. We haven't given training in that organisation. We don't know the organisation. It's used generically.
So, a program model is a model that really is a model usually of a set of principles that tie all your services together. It gives you a focus. The sanctuary model is a program model. Many of you know that one. Our care program is a program model. Teaching families is also a program model, and so on. You can have all sorts of services and different projects within it to serve the needs of your kids, but you have this whole kind of tie together. Program models generally have, or have to have, theories of change. Now, if you ask them out of this particular facility what their theory of change is, that would be quite an interesting thing. How do you drive the devil out of a kid? You're going to use what? A stick. You're going to give them punishment. It's going to be compliance and control, and so on. So, again, perfect example of the kinds of toxicity that occurs in organizations. Let's talk about clinical participation, intake, assessment, treatment, and so on. Again, I usually separate some of these things out, but for this particular program, I'm putting those together. Again, what I see in toxic organizations is that clinicians are divorced from the population of kids. And in some of the facilities, you actually have separate locked wings where the clinicians are. And if I want to see my social worker, I have to go to a locked door, bang on the door, or push the button, and ask to see the social worker. Someone comes out into the hallway and then says to the kid or says to me, yes, you can, or no, you can't. Do you have an appointment, Margaret? No, I don't. You can't see your social worker. I was involved in one particular facility where the entire clinical staff was off in another wing. You couldn't get into the building. It was locked. And when kids were in some trouble, wanted to see their social worker, they were banging on the door. Somebody would come running after them, and they'd get restrained in front of the door because they wanted to see their clinician. Now, that's an extreme example. Usually what we see when we're talking about there's a kind of lack of clinical participation is we see this kind of stuff. Where the facility itself doesn't give weight to clinical people. So they can overrule a physician. They can overrule the individual crisis management plan, the safety plan for the child, and so on. And if that individual crisis management plan is developed by a physician and by a clinician, then you have non-clinical people overriding what is essentially a clinical or medical decision for the kid. And it's allowed in the facility. That is one of the things, Sam, I'm not sure if you would like to take a case like that, but it seems like a slam dunk, at least to make some points here, that in fact, do you always have non-medical people overriding your medical decisions in your particular facility? Because that's exactly what something like this is. And again, it's an example of the kind of element of toxicity that we begin to see here. Intake. We have had in the States one of the worst policies where a county would contract with a facility to take any kid that comes in the door. And these facilities had to take them or they would lose their contract, which means that facilities took kids they couldn't deal with, they couldn't handle. They had no ability to reject a placement. And if agencies lose control of their intake, they're then a different kind of animal and a different kind of being. You have to have an entirely different kind of structure if in fact you have no control of your intake. You have to be much more like an emergency room. You have to be set up for anything. And without that, you're in deep trouble, and you're not going to be able to meet the needs of kids. So again, one of the things that we see when we talk about toxicity in organizations are organizations that have completely lost control of their intake and actually take pride in it. They take any kid. So, clinical incident review. Here we have a juvenile justice facility where staff comes in the morning, announces that they're in a pissed off mood, says that what's going to happen is that if some kid gets under my skin, then that kid's going to eat the tile. That means their face is going to be in the floor. Later that day, there's a restraint. It says that in front of witnesses, by the way, and supervisor. Restraint occurs. They do a clinical incident report. That's never brought up. They do, the restraint, in fact, was seen as necessary. No ability to self-reflect and connect the event from the morning to the afternoon. So again, you start to have these particular situations where staff, in fact, is out of control. There's very little supervision. There's no monitoring of events. There's little learning going on in the facility. So, supervision. Who's heard this in their practice? Anybody want to admit to having heard it? I have people coming up to me after this presentation often and just saying, you know, some of these examples, especially this one here, where people are actually whispering in your ear, don't listen to them. In fact, you know, here's how we do things here. So in fact, what's going on here is you have the supervisor, in fact, is kind of divorced from the life of the facility. Someone else has kind of taken over the unit. Supervision, often in toxic facilities, is infrequent. Or there's something else that goes on. A lot of these facilities that I have worked in, staff are trained up the wazoo. In other words, they have a lot of training. But there's never any connection of this training to, in fact, what's going on within the facility. It has very little relationship to what these kids need. It has much more relationship to things like compliance and control. So if they teach, I'll use our own program, the TCI program, they're going to focus on the physical interventions. They're not going to be talking about the behavioral support and so on. And then when they get into a particular event, oh, we used all our TCI skills. And you start to ask them what, in fact, they were, and they're talking about all the physical intervention skills. They have no concept of how to, in fact, have used the behavior support system. Another element, fear and aggression. Now, there's a follow-up to this that makes this interesting. First of all, let me just say, if kids are afraid, staff is afraid. If staff exhibit fear, kids are afraid. Fear is one of those elements in an organization that's spread over the organization. If it occurs with one or two staff in one or two units, it's probably in all units. So it is not something that's localized. It's a bit of a general infection. When I was interviewing the executive director about this particular event, this event was not motivated by fear. The kid didn't jump out the window. The child was just concerned about his safety. He was not afraid. Not afraid in the facility. It was not an example of fear. Well, what would your response do? Because I'll tell you, how would you have responded to something like that? I'll tell you how I did. I was dumbstruck. I didn't know what to say. I was completely silent for way too long. And I think he realized that perhaps he should have said something different to me, but I thought, boy. But it is one of the things you see that people won't confront the issue of fear or aggression often. They'll change the language on you. They'll call it something else. And I thought that was a perfect example of it. Here's aggression. So the kid was raped by the handle of a wooden handle of a plunger. It was actually, as it says, there was actually a disturbance going on. It kept being called a riot, but I was going to put riot in quotes, but it was actually a disturbance, and it was an agency-wide disturbance. And that's when the kid was sexually assaulted. This is also a perfect example of losing control of your intake, because he was a kid that was drug dependent, had no history of sexual abuse, and was placed in a unit with sexual predators because they wanted to maintain their intake. The response to this was staff beat up the kids who raped the child. So you get the kind of cyclical issue going on. This was an interesting case because there are not many attorneys here, but one of the things that I found is that when attorneys are defending these cases, my sense is that they don't know how off-standard that practice is. That somehow they feel that, this kind of thing can occur, it can happen. You're nodding, you've seen that. This is one of those cases where the attorneys were defending the facility, tooth and nail. They had offered a significant amount of money to settle the case, and the plaintiff's attorney said no, gave the judge my report. The judge suggested that the defending attorneys read the report. They came back 2 hours later and tripled the settlement. So I think that the report was a way of kind of educating the people who were actually defending this case and saying, this is something serious. This should not have gone on. I think what was going on with the facility and the defense of this was that these boys were predators, and that's why it happened. What they failed to tell the attorneys is that the staff were involved in teaching those boys a lesson. So let me just finish with this. We're talking here about a confluence of events. We're talking about intake policies gone awry. We're talking about external events, closing of juvenile detention facilities to provide more quote-unquote community care. You're talking about poor staffing here. There's a variety of things going on. You're talking about the fact that there's almost no supervision for our young staff. And you have a tragedy. You have a child care worker who was killed. One of the things, just in summary, elements of toxicity are never stable, but they always change and they're dynamic. They're always changing and dynamic. Subtle modifications, though, can significantly change the dynamics of an agency. No one element is paramount, but if you focus on leadership, mission, and program, they seem to be the inoculating agents for toxicity. If you can focus on leadership, the mission of the agency, and their program model, it seems that you can begin to slowly dilute the toxicity in agencies. Thank you.